Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to In Rhythm Lightning Talks. I'm Parag Katkar, your host for tonight. I'm the Senior Director of Enterprise Solutions at In Rhythm. And this year we have several exciting lightning talks lined up for you. In Rhythm Lightning Talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And each week, one of our practice area consultants speak on the latest technology trends in the industry, which will help you keep learning and growing in your career. So this week, Josh Espinosa, who is a software engineer with us, is going to talk about the feature abstraction with the composition API in Vue 2. I'm really excited about this one. Let's get it started, Josh.
All right, thanks, Parag. As he mentioned, my name is Josh Espinosa. I'm a front-end developer, been working with Rhythm as a consultant at MasterCard for the past 2 years. I've been working with Vue.js for the past 4 years. Today I'm going to talk about feature abstraction using the new composition API and how to use it in Vue 2. So what is the composition API and why do we care? The composition API is a shiny new Vue 3 feature that's been backported over for use in Vue 2 via an official plugin at Vue/composition API. So this is great if your team or your company is unwilling to update to the bleeding edge of Vue 3, which is essentially still in beta, and it lets you still take advantage of the new features. So the point of the composition API is to take features scattered throughout a component and group them together in a logical means, have them all contained within their own functions, and then it lets you compose logic yourself later. I consider this the successor to mixins, Vue 2 mixins, and as we'll see, this is really Vue 3's answer to all the problems that mixins pose in Vue 2. So take, for example, you have a few features within one component. You're going to have code for each individual feature scattered throughout your file. You'll have some code in data, some in methods, some in created, before destroy, and so forth. This is really hard to maintain. If you have to make changes to one feature, you'll have to go scrolling up and down throughout your file, looking for all the pieces that connect to that feature. And this might not be extremely obvious at the time. So the Vue Composition API, solves this problem by essentially allowing you to defragment your file by logical concerns or features into self-contained functions, for composition later on. So how do I go about achieving this in Vue 2 using the composition API? So let me just talk about the basics a bit. So the composition API is going to add this new setup option to your component files. And in here is where you'll do all the composition API work. And outside of this function, it'll be treated as normal Vue 2 options API. So this is great because you can use them at the same time, composition API and the options API, and you can pick and choose what you want to use to get the best of both worlds. So on the left here, I'm using refs, and on the right here, I'm using reactive. So what these are ways to define variables. So ref is essentially used, or is normally used for primitives. You can give it an object, but if you do, it'll just use reactive behind the scenes. So ref creates a reactive reference to some inner value. So it's essentially wrapping taking this inner value, for example, the string Anderson, and wrapping it in an object with value set to what value you gave it. There's more behind the scenes, but this is how you can imagine it. So in order to change the value, once it's been, once you create a ref, you'll have to access that inner value and then set it to something. So this syntax is slightly different, but it's worth, you get the hang of it. On the other hand, there's reactive, which creates a deep reactive copy of an object. So this actually has some more magic to it. So when you want to change one of the values within the reactive object, you can simply access it as normal JavaScript. So notice how here we're doing consumer.id equals something, and we do not need to do consumer.id.value equals something. So some people prefer reactive because it's more similar to what they already know with the Vue 2 options API. However, the trend I've been seeing is that, especially when using the composition API plugin in Vue 2, is to primarily use refs as it's more flexible. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. At the bottom of each setup function, you'll see that we have a return. This is basically returning these values and it's exposing them to the rest of your file. So it's transitioning from the composition API to the options API. So then you'll be able to use them as normal data or methods. So then you can use them in the template just like normal, and you can also access it with this dot. So on the right here, we just have some sample code. I'll just walk through it real quick. So in setup, this occurs before all the other lifecycle hooks, and you can even replace created with it entirely. Another thing I'll mention real quick is that you'll be doing all the imports for the composition API specific things from the plugin. In View 3, it's built in, so you don't need to import it. But in View 2, you will. So in the setup function, we're just setting some default data with the consumer name, Jon Snow. And then in the mounted lifecycle hook, we are, after 1 second, we're changing the name to Rick Sanchez. Before I continue, is there any questions about, up to this point? High-level questions, ideally. We can save the detailed questions for the end. All right, if no further questions, let's talk about feature abstraction. So here I'll walk through 3 different scenarios, one without the composition API, one answer that View 2 has using mixins, and then using the composition API. So without the composition API, here's like an example. You have feature A and B and code for each of the features scattered throughout your file. This is just one file and 2 screenshots. So in data, we have feature A, in purple, and then all the feature B in green. So you can imagine, this might seem simple with a small file, but when you have hundreds of lines of code with multiple features, it doesn't scale well. It's hard to maintain. And you have to make a change. If product comes to you and says, make a change for feature A, then you have to go throughout the entire file looking for every piece that relates to it in order to update that. So one thing you can do in View 2 is abstract each feature into its own file. And it mimics the syntax of the single file component. And then these options get merged in when you import and include it in mixins. So this might seem great, but in practice, not so much, because this leads to many different problems. For example, and it looks simple right now, but this is just a demo. It usually won't look this simple. And if your file is this small, you probably don't need what I'm talking about at all. But for example, one of the issues is if you look here in the template, we see on the click event, we're going to invoke this another method for feature A function. Then you're like, especially if you're looking at this file for the first time, you then go, okay, you look at the rest of the file and you're like, wait, this isn't being defined anywhere. So this is confusing. So then you're like, is this supposed to be here? Is this leftover code? And just to make sure, you do a project-wide search, and then you see, oh, wait, no, it's in this file. It's in this mixin file. And oh, look, it's being included in this mixin. I didn't even see this line. So it's like really easy to miss. And if you didn't see that this mixin, these mixins are being imported, it might lead to some more confusion. And you just have to kind of go back and forth, trying to sort out this logic. So yeah, this is also bad because there's potential for name collisions. If you name something in the component file, the same thing as in your mixin, there's a merge strategy applied, and then you have to remember in what order the merging happens. Like for example, lifecycle hooks, if you have mounted in your mixin and in your component, the mixin will get put in an array before the mounted hook, and you have to remember, does the mixin go first, or does the lifecycle hook in the component execute first? And you just have to kind of, there's just a lot more overhead in dealing with mixins. So instead of making it easier, it makes it more difficult to work with. On the other hand, there's the composition API, which solves all these problems. So while this might seem like a little more code, I promise you it's much more scalable and readable for large files. So it's the same kind of idea. You abstract each feature into its own file, but this time each feature is its own function. And then within this function, we're going to, at the end of it, rather, we're going to return the values that we want the component to use. And then when we invoke this function, we can then destructure or pick out the properties that we want to use in our setup function. And then we expose them to the rest of our component. So while I'm importing and exporting and importing everything that's being exported here, you don't have to. You can pick and choose what you want from the composition function. And so this is another great benefit to this, because mixins, you don't have that choice. It'll merge everything whether you like it or not. So here, this is more modular. So you can use your composition function in different ways. So let me talk. Oh yeah, so for example, this is the problem that we had faced with the mixin scenario is solved here. So when we look at onClick, another method for feature A, we can see, oh, look, it's right there. It's defined here, and it belongs to feature A. So there's a lot less, guesswork involved, and you can you don't even have to look at the feature, the composition function. You can kind of just keep it black box in your mind when you're reading through the code, especially if you don't even need to worry about that feature for the changes that you're trying to make. So let me talk about the anatomy of these composition functions very briefly. As mentioned before, it's one big function. Your variables will be either reactive through ref or reactive or not. And so this is another great benefit. If you've ever used Vue 2 enough, you'll know that there's no official way of opting out of the reactivity engine. So this leads to hack solutions in order to make a variable non-reactive. And with the composition API, you just simply don't make it reactive, and you can use it like normal JavaScript variable. It's great. So this way we can keep the internals black boxed in this composition function. Your methods will just become normal JavaScript functions, and that's it. And then you just export what you want the components to use. All right, before I go further, are there any questions up to this point? To make sure everyone's on the same page. All right, great. So let's talk about some issues I've had or some things I've learned when implementing this in our project at MasterCard. One of the big things was lifecycle hooks. So the composition API allows you to do more than just ref and reactive, but I was keeping it simple for this demo. So you can import lifecycle hooks from the plugin and use them independently in your composition function. So when I add this to my composition function, this is basically saying when the component reaches the mounted hook lifecycle state, then execute the code within. So this might seem great in theory, but if you want to share lifecycle hooks throughout all your components, but if we recall, these composition functions are very modular, and you might only want a piece of it. So what happens when you just want some small variable, like reactive variable, you pull that in, but then to pull it in, you need to invoke it, right? So then when you're destructuring that one little piece, you're still invoking the function. So this means that this code is going to execute. So this is going to lead to some side effects, and it'll pose the same problems that mixin, some of the same problems that mixins have, where things are happening behind the scenes unintentionally. So in order to get around this, the idea is to make things more obvious, more clear where things are coming from with this API. So what I recommend, or what I did, was I simply exported the function that I want to use in the lifecycle hook. And then in the component itself, I'm letting the component decide when to actually execute it. So in the component, the option is either, once you pull it in, you can put it within the composition API mounted hook, or you can expose it again to the rest of the file and use the normal mounted hook with the options API. So this way it's more explicit, and then you can take advantage of the composition function's modularity without fear of something, of some side effects in the background. Another thing was when integrating with Vuex, it wasn't very simple out of the box. This is still a very new field, Vue 3. So I had some trouble with worrying about, the right store instance, whether or not the store was actually created at the right time, and so forth. And then the interface was, different. So something that helped me a lot was the package Vuex composition helpers. This simplifies the interface. You don't have to worry about as much, and it brings it back to syntax that's similar to Vue 2, with where you can use stuff like map state, map actions, and so forth. Another more advanced gotcha that I faced was when I had multiple components that, or rather, there was a feature that a intermediate component depended on. And I wanted to share this intermediate component with the other components that used it so I wouldn't have to duplicate the template code. Because Composition API, from what you've seen so far, you're abstracting things in the script, the logic itself. But then what about, what if you wanted to share some template between your components that uses only the data in one of your composition functions? So in order to do that, I thought, okay, let me just create a component within, self-contained component within the composition function. But then when exporting that and using it in all my other components, it created an unintentional singleton sharing that same component instance. So instead, to get around this, what I did was I just created render functions to kind of outline the skeleton of the component. And then I had each component render its own instance of it using dynamic components. So that's something you could use. That's one option. And last piece of advice is not to be overeager when using it, like I was. I saw a shiny new toy. Let me just use it for everything. This is great. But, this isn't always ideal. If you're not going to actually reuse it in other components, then you're just creating additional files that you need to maintain. And you're just moving if you're moving logic out of sight, you might be misusing it just for the sake of using it. So really think about if you need it. Practice AHA, which stands for Avoid Hasty Abstractions. And this has helped me a lot in my career. So yeah. In conclusion, once again, I highly recommend this mainly for projects that are scaling, large projects, or when you have a component with multiple features intertwined throughout. This is great for that. It excels. In the best case, it excels when you have multiple components that have a lot of shared logic, but maybe they even vary slightly. And it might be hard to abstract normally, especially with things like mixins. So this is great for that because it's a lot more versatile and you have more control. So I recommend that. So this reduces maintenance costs tremendously and development time. So previously, when we had to make a change to a feature, we would have to go into each component file and make the same changes in like a slightly different way. But with the composition API, now we just have to change it at the source, at the composition function file, and it just applies to everything, wonderfully. You might not want to use it if your project is too small and you don't need it yet. Or if you are not going to be using the logic and you're just using it for the sake of it, like we talked about before. And lastly, if every millisecond really counts. So this is only going to be if your application is the purpose of it is extremely maximum performance. It will add 10 milliseconds on average, maybe 80 milliseconds worst case to your application's runtime. But the benefits of this API highly outweigh all the negatives. The main negative is just this performance drawback. And that's basically it. If you're interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend viewmastery.com, especially Greg Pollock's courses. He's very articulate and it's easy to understand through his nice visuals, some of which I used in this presentation. And he also does a deep dive with Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, on the composition API itself. Another great resource is frontendmasters.com. It's great for general Vue knowledge. They talk about the composition API just a little bit. So it's mainly for general Vue knowledge, but Evan Yu also does a deep dive on how Vue 2 works, especially the reactivity engine. So I highly recommend you check it out. And of course, the Vue 3 docs are great. But something to keep in mind is that full-blown Vue 3 is different than, the adapter plugin that's, for the backported version for Vue 2. Limitations, you shouldn't pose an issue to your project unless you're doing extremely advanced stuff. But to make it even less likely not to pose an issue, I highly recommend you use refs over reactive as much as possible. All right, are there any questions?